Good afternoon.
It's the usual, right? You wouldn't want for me to have a...
Quist from Brown University, and it is my pleasure today to moderate the panel entitled Education, Competencies, and Skills for Librarianship in the 21st Century. I don't know about you, but the first thing that struck me is that the title didn't say Music Librarianship in the 21st Century, and I think that's on purpose. Anna and Michael did a splendid job of putting this panel together, and I just have the pleasure of introducing them. So I'm very pleased to be here for two reasons. Number one, to introduce such a distinguished panel. And number two, because I'm very anxious to hear what they have to say. During the past year at Brown, we hired something like 14 librarians. So I'm very anxious to hear what other people's experiences have been lately with the competencies of librarianship. So I'm going to begin by introducing all four panelists, and then we'll ask each of them to speak for about 10 minutes. And I've already told them I'll give them a warning when their 10 minutes is approaching a conclusion. And then I hope we'll get into a conversation with the panel. I have a bunch of canned questions in case no one out there feels terribly inspired. So believe me, there will be a conversation. Let me start with our hostess, Michele Cloonan, who's the Dean and Professor at Simmons College of the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. Also here today is Paula Matthews, who many of you know as a longtime member of MLA. And she is the Stanford Calderwood Director and Librarian at the Boston Athenaeum. Ann Wolpert is the Director of Libraries for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And finally, Greg Pronevitz is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Library System. I'm going to ask Ann to speak first, and then we'll hear from Michele, and then Paula, and then Greg, if that's all right.
Well, it's a real trait when your name starts with W to go first, because I spend my whole life in the back of the classroom and speaking last, so thank you for that privilege. I'm very glad that this program is not talking about music libraries, because if it were, I wouldn't be here. I know, in fact, very little about music libraries, except what Peter Munstedt and Christy Moore and others in the music library have taught me over the years. When Michael called, I was reminded of one of the bad music jokes that Peter publishes in his newsletter. There was a story about a string trio that was killed in an automobile accident, and they ended up at the pearly gates in front of St. Peter, and St. Peter said to them, so what did you do that was worthy? And cellist said, well, I taught people and showed people the beauty of music. And St. Peter said, you're in. And the violist said, I taught people and showed people the joy of music. And St. Peter says, you're in. And he gets to the violinist and says, what did you do? And the violinist said, I was a concert master, and excuse me, but you're sitting in my chair. So I have no right to a chair that talks about music librarianship, but I do know a little bit about running a research library in an academic institution that's highly focused on science and technology. And it's in that context today that I thought I'd give a few observations in response to the theme of the session today. I think that there is probably nothing that we do at MIT that's unique or unusual. And I would say we're probably not even the best at what we do in many cases. But collectively, I think we represent the kinds of activities that are going on in research libraries these days. And so I offer MIT's examples not because we're anything close to perfect, but because I think we're representative. One of the questions that was raised in today's series of inquiries about the future of librarianship in the 21st century had to do with subject specialists. And I have to say that MIT's libraries are actually built around the concept of subject specialization. It is core to the way we approach our work. We call them liaisons to departments, labs, and centers, not necessarily subject specialists, but what they are basically is subject specialists on steroids, and Peter and Christy are among them. We've done a series of planning exercises in the MIT libraries over the last several years, and we have come to the conclusion that the libraries are a service organization that is really an implacable partner with research and education at MIT. And we were quite gratified when our visiting committee was here about this time last year that the first thing they highlighted about the MIT libraries after their review was the degree to which faculty and students view the MIT libraries as partners in research and education. And that certainly is one of our priorities. A faculty member the other day told me that he thought that the MIT libraries were like oxygen to the Institute. They were everywhere. They were what people needed to live, and that we needed to keep that up. Whatever it is we were doing, we needed to keep that up. And of course, by the way, they wanted more of this and a little more of that and longer hours, but there you go. So our tagline is that you can be in the MIT libraries wherever you are and whenever you want. And librarians are conceived of as being on a team, being partners with faculty and students. I would say that even our collections are positioned as a service. So when we think about our collections, we think of them with the goal of getting our information assets. We spend a lot of money on these collections, and we think of them as assets. We don't think of them as a sunk cost. We think of them as assets. And our goal is to get these assets into the hands of faculty and students and research staff at MIT as quickly and conveniently as possible. So that's what we're focused on doing. And this kind of proactive librarianship needs professionals, to the second part of today's panel, who really can engage with faculty and graduate students around their research passions. And that's why subject specialization is at the heart of what we do, because faculty and students envision themselves as studying in a discipline, and we envision ourselves as being part of a partnership that helps them be productive in their research and in pursuing their education. So, bottom line, in our environment, familiarity with a subject is essential, but it's also insufficient. The job duties of liaisons, information specialists at MIT, go well beyond the traditional tasks of selection, classification, staffing a reference desk, the kinds of tasks that we often associate with librarianship. And that's because the content that we acquire on behalf of our community increasingly comes in large digital packages of information. It isn't processed the same way individual tangible items are. It isn't delivered the same way that individual tangible items are. And so our approach to providing service is focused on making sure that faculty and students can work online, can take advantage, maximum advantage of these digital investments. So we build sophisticated infrastructures. We help people navigate the arcane technology that's associated with getting to what you want through a series of different vendor products. And we work to make the space of the libraries a vibrant and welcoming part of the research and education experience at MIT. Yes, we have content in those libraries. Yes, we have hardware and software in those libraries. But the libraries aren't considered only as a location where materials can be sought. They're considered part of the intellectual life and the student experience at MIT. So our subject specialists are more than subject specialists, and they handle more than what you might think of as the core curriculum. So if you go to MIT's music library webpage, their homepage, you'll see what some of the attributes of a 21st century librarian involve. It's a beautifully designed website. It does marketing and branding. You can see events planning going on in the background. You can see donor relations and fundraising on that web page and the pages behind it. You can see the way space planning and utilization skills and experience work into the kinds of events and activities that happen in a place that is a community center. You can see the collaboration and team skills behind internal collaborations that are reflected on those pages and interinstitutional collaborations that are reflected on those pages. You can see that technology is a tool which is deeply embedded in the work of MIT's music library. It's not just about the technology of delivery, it's the technology of using new kinds of resources, downloading them, managing them, experimenting with them. The music library imagines itself as a place where people can go in and play with new devices to see how they work in terms of their own education and research. And you can see that the services they offer are around information resources, but they're also around bibliographic management tools and the other kinds of tools that scholars need to use in order to be successful and productive in their careers. So bibliographic management tools, Mendeley, the software that you need to work in certain environments, these are all competencies that are reflected in the music library and the work that they do. So let me just close by saying that I think Michele Cloonan has an impossible job because she's being asked as the dean of GSLIS to prepare a whole variety of subject specialists and other kinds of librarians for their first job. But she's also being asked to ready these people to spend the rest of their life in learning mode. The subjects with which people will engage are in constant motion, always moving forward, always developing new arenas. Information and communication technology is always moving forward, always introducing new things that we need to learn. And the practice of librarianship and the discipline of information science on which the practice of librarianship is grounded, these are all in motion as well. So I think that if there is one skill for librarianship in the 21st century that I would lay on the table at this point in the discussion, it is really that every librarian has to be prepared to wake up every morning and learn something new. Make yourself uncomfortable. Learn things that you're edgy about. Test yourself in domains that you have not had a comfort level in before. And that's the future of all kinds of librarianship, not just music librarianship. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was great. And actually, I want to respond to your last comment. We all listen to a lot of media in our lives, and I listen to radio a lot, and I love financial planning programs. Maybe because I'm hoping through osmosis, I'll actually figure it out one of these days. But there's a new concept that's out. Remember that whole three-legged stool? It's going to be your Social Security and your pension and your savings and retirement. Well, now they're looking at financial planning in a different way that incorporates investing in yourself. And what some financial planners are advocating is that every year you should be doing something for yourself, for your career, for your learning, and updating your CV. And that, of course, ultimately helps with your financial planning because you'll be more marketable. So I think this is sort of an interesting idea, and I think we're going to be hearing more about it in future. It's something that I've just heard really in the last few months, and I'm sure it's very much in response to the kind of economic climate that we've all been living through. So I'm going to try to sort of give you a landscape from where I sit. And it may be very different from the kind of landscape that you'll get from the others on the panel, but I hope it may provide a few insights. So about 10 times a year, we have information sessions at Simmons where people come to campus to look at our program. Increasingly, we have people coming from all over the country, actually, for these visits. And it doesn't take long before they ask me what the job outlook looks like. And, of course, this is foremost in everybody's mind. So what sources do I have to go to get a sense of this landscape? And so the sources that I look at are the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then GSLIS statistics, that's the Association for Library and Information Science Education, and the American Library Association. And I just wanted to share just a few of those with you so you can sort of see what the landscape looks like. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics issues outlooks on the various professions. They haven't done one for about 3 years for our profession, and of course they probably gathered a lot of the data before the financial meltdown that happened here. But with their last report, they predicted an 8% growth for librarianship, a 20+% growth for archives, and a 20+% growth in computer science and some areas of computer science. So what does this mean, and what was this based on? Well, they do a lot of information gathering for jobs that are out there, but the American Library Association looks at age of people in the workforce. And my predecessor as dean was Jim Matarazzo, and he used to like to say that librarians are the second oldest profession. Yes, they're grave diggers. And sure enough, in 2005, 40% of librarians were between 50 and 59 years old, and 15% were 60 years or older. So that means 55% of this profession is 50 or over. Now, about 4 or 5 years ago, there were predictions that there were going to be mass retirements by now, which didn't happen in part because of the economy and people weren't feeling comfortable enough to retire. But I think more of these retirements are happening now. And eventually they will happen. And one of the things that I've just noticed more anecdotally from my experience in academic libraries is that associate university librarians are often close in age to the director. So what you had were people moving up who were very close in age, so that when they all retired, there's going to be a whole layer of management that goes with them. What does that mean? Well, for our graduates, it means that they're going to move up a lot more quickly. Believe it or not, when I started in this profession in the 70s, the projection was if you wanted to be a library director, it would be about a 20 to 25-year career trajectory because people didn't move and you went through large university libraries in a very orderly, hierarchical way. You know, first you'd work at a section, maybe you'd be a section head and a department head and an AUL, and it seemed as though it was like 5 to 7 years in each of those places. And that's already no longer the case and hasn't been the case for at least a decade. So it means that we somehow have to prepare our students to move up through the management ranks more quickly, and also just to think about leadership in different ways, and also to be nimble and responsive to the different kinds of environments that they'll work in. When Megatrends was written, when John Nesbitt wrote Megatrends in the 1980s, he was predicting back then that people would have 6 careers, which seemed over the top back then, and now, of course, doesn't. So how do we prepare students for this? I think it happens inside the classroom. It happens outside the classroom, as I mentioned this morning, through professional engagement. So I just wanted to look at some of the ways in which we're doing this within GSLIS. We do not have an online program here, as many of our peer institutions now do, somewhat by design, because if we did online, we wanted to do it well, and we didn't have the infrastructure to support it. We have postmaster's degrees that are online. We have hybrid courses. And we were a very early member of the WISE consortium, which I also mentioned this morning. And in fact, when I talked about sharing courses, I've had 3 students now take Richard Smaraglia's music cataloging class through the WISE consortium. He's at UW Milwaukee. We also try to infuse technology into the curriculum as a way of thinking. So with preservation, for example, we think of stewardship of collections, whether they're paper-based or digital. And we've partnered with the University of Mid-Sweden, University College London, NYU, and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee through this digital curriculum lab. So we can so the students can work together on projects, even though they'll never meet each other, in a very dynamic, proactive way that we think mirrors the way work will be in the future. It's been team-based in libraries for ages now, but it's going to be more team-based across institutions, online as well as face-to-face, and we already see professional conferences going more and more this kind of direction. So I think that's exciting. And I think that through this kind of sharing with library and information science programs that we're going to be able to address these issues of preparing specialists to work with each other in new ways and to expand the kinds of offerings that we can have here. We are going to be launching, and I hope it'll be for next year, we'll find out in a week, we've designed an online archives program. And we think that ours will be different. There's only a couple of others. We think ours will be different and better because we are incorporating the internship component into the online program because of our extensive networks throughout the country and even in the world. If our students want to intern in a different country now and we have the connections, we're able to provide these opportunities for them. So with any luck, that program will be up and running next year. So I think that what I'm seeing in the job place, to go back to the question, are there jobs? My first answer to students or prospective students is that you have to be nimble, you have to probably specialize in more than one thing, and you have to be able to move to where the opportunities are. And also, where sometimes it seems like there's downsizing in one institution, there might be a lot of hiring in another. And I've certainly seen this constantly. One institution is consolidating, another institution's hiring. But a lot of the places that are hiring, I believe, and we'll see if my other panelists agree, are in new areas. Metadata specialists, digital curators. They certainly depend on the same kinds of basic values and skills that we've always taught people, but it's a different way of approaching information and the needs of institutions, in this kind of environment. So stay tuned. I think we'll continue to try to push the boundaries in the field as we move forward.
Can you hear me? It's great to see such a wonderful turnout for a NEMLA meeting. My name's Paula Matthews. Many of you knew me in my previous guise as music librarian, and now I work in a membership library, which is kind of a niche market. Their nod to my subject expertise when I came was to put all the reference books in my office on music, where they have pretty much sat up until this point. It was not a music job, but as an aside, I can say that late in your career, you can become a subject specialist. For the last 3.5 years, virtually the only thing I've read are books about early American history. For those of you who may not know what the Boston Athenaeum is, or an Athenaeum, these are private membership libraries that began here very early on. The oldest is in the oldest is in Newport, the Redwood. It was based actually on an Athenaeum model. In the days of high intellect in Athens, people gathered at temples and shared scrolls and debated innovated and had a wonderful intellectual environment. And in the 18th century, that happened again in England. And the big model for Athenaeum here is the Liverpool Athenaeum. They've dwindled. There are only about 15. We are the largest. And while we say we're an Athenaeum, we're less a member of that group than a group such as the American Antiquarian Society, the Newberry Library, the Huntington, the Morgan. In other words, we're a very hybrid institution. We have a phenomenal research collection of about 750,000 items of various kinds, and about 100,000 of those are considered rare. We got all the 16th century books off the shelf, but every once in a while I'll find one. So it's a quirky kind of place that way. So our peers are richer, but they look towards the same problems that we do, I think, and that all of you do. And interestingly enough, the model, this hybrid model of reaching out and having children's events and lectures and music is something that was followed then by the public libraries in America. That you were not just a museum of books, you actually provided intellectual stimulation for your members. Just an aside of interest to the library folk, a very early librarian was Charles Cutter, and we did not start classing into LC until the late 1970s. So we often get scholars who come just to look at our extensive Cutter collection because it's extensive and impossible to use. We have very little, I can say, and I do it for a living. It's also strange in that our mission is twofold. The best of the future, the best of the past is kind of my elevator speech. It's a 19th century building. We started in 1809, but the building that we now live in on 10.5 Beacon, and it is 10.5, which if you tell a cab driver is difficult, and the post office. But that building was built in 1849, and we've been there since. We're lucky to back up on the granary, so we'll never have buildings around us. But this building had been renovated twice, once in the early 20th century, and then about a decade ago, between 1999 and 2002. And at that point, the collections and the staff were moved out for almost 3 years. All the plaster was taken down. And in that renovation, we developed a very sophisticated technology infrastructure in the building. And when you go in, it really presents as a 19th century building, but the entire building is wireless. We allow our members through a proxy server to have access to our databases, and that includes LexisNexis and JSTOR, Project Muse, Naxos. So we increasingly have members who are independent scholars who cannot get access if they're not at a university. Gillian Anderson, some of you know her as the world authority on American musical theater, retired, and she lives in Italy, and she became a member so she could of the Athenaeum, so she could use those resources there. We have a lot of student members because the university and college libraries are said to be noisy. I don't know if that's true anymore, but we don't allow cell phones, and my daughter used to come and study when she was an undergraduate. I think she pretended she lived there too. It's this 19th century atmosphere. We lost, during what I call the smuta, not only 25% or more of our endowment, we lost 25% of our staff. Which was, as they say, an opportunity in some ways. It was not an opportunity for our staff. Of the 14 people who left, not one of them could find another job in the job market. And that had to do with the lack of internal training, the lack of keeping up with professional skills. So that's just a caveat. Once you get a job, keep learning every day. Recently, we were able to hire back in 4 positions, and it's an interesting mix. We needed a new director of development. We hired an electronic services librarian. We hired the second person in the systems office. This one stalwart person had been the systems office for a very long time, and a new conservator in our conservation lab. So you kind of see the extremes of what we're trying to support. We're always going to support the historiography of the place and the collections. And I would like to say to Michele that Simmons does a wonderful job of training students come to places like ours because of the double major, the subject major in history and in librarianship, and we get lots of people who come from that program. But as we were hiring, the resumes were astounding, and the number of them was overwhelming. But in the end, and when we did the interviews, there was a sense of the people who we finally hired that they were willing to be flexible. That, we had a job description, of course, and at the end it says other duties as required, but that they really seemed willing to change because even though we're old, we're a very fast-changing organization. To say we were late adapters would be kind, but by the time we do adapt, we're pretty sure of what we want. And the skills that the young people who we've hired brought in are skills that have been shared with the whole staff. Which is wonderful. And so as you enter your first job or your second job, just understand that you'll probably be working with people who haven't had the opportunity to have that kind of training, and that's something that you'll probably be expected to share. I'd like to reiterate whoever said something about relocating. For a period, it must have been in the 80s, I was the placement officer of the Music Library Association and had a wonderful interview with a young man who worked at the American Music Center in New York who wanted to move on. And my first question was, are you willing to relocate? And he said, I don't really want to move to the East Side. Just so you know, I've been out in the middle. I went to school there. I lived there. It's great. I've been to the other side. The single thing that holds our interns back is that they say they will never leave Boston. And, and for many reasons that may be true, but there are a lot of wonderful places in America and in the world that aren't Boston. So if you can see kind of past that, that would be probably helpful. The skills that we ask for in team building that everyone does, people have to have a concrete example. We say, give us some instances in which you've worked collaboratively. If they can't come up with that, if you ask somebody, do you believe in teamwork? Of course. You're not going to say, no, I like to work in a room alone. But there has to be something about their presentation or their resume that really speaks to that willingness. In the old days, when Marie Sullivan was going around and doing these workshops on team building, Ned's shaking his head. I was in one, and I said, well, let's use this model. It's an orchestra. And there are principals in the orchestra. There's a conductor. Sometimes there's a soloist. Sometimes you don't have a conductor at all. Everybody hates the oboe player. The trombones go out and drink until the end because they don't have anything in the middle. But they're united by one goal, to play the best Brahms fourth you've ever heard. So they'll get past the crazy oboe player. If they're not principal, they'll meld into the orchestra. They'll look at the conductor, even though they may want to, disagree with him. But if you have that common goal, the other example I've used, and it's failed completely, is the body. I'll say, well, you're the liver, and you're the kidney, and you're the brain, and you're the heart. And the patient was dead on the table pretty much every time we tried that because of people's unwillingness to kind of work together. The flexibility part really can't be overemphasized in a place like mine, because not only do people have to wake up and learn something new every day, they have to wake up and learn something old every day because of the historic nature of our collections. And just one last aside, in some ways, this is a difficult job, but for those of you who know me, it's kind of a perfect job because we allow dogs in the library, well-behaved dogs on leashes, and we have dogs who come to poetry readings, and a particular dog who likes to go to story hours, and people climb on him like a horse. So I hope you get a chance to come by and visit. It's free and open to the public on the first floor, and very reasonable membership for the rest. And there is no references. People used to think you had to know somebody who was a Cabot or a Coolidge or a Lodge to become a member, but there's no requirement for a reference or anything other than a desire to be in a beautiful historic place. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me ask a question before I start about who knows a lot about the Massachusetts library system? Raise your hand. Okay, not a lot of people. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do so you can see where I'm coming from. My name is Greg Pronevitz. I'm the executive director of the Massachusetts library system. We're an organization that's about a year and a half old. We were formed by the merger of 6 previously existing regional library systems in Massachusetts. We are a state-funded organization, but we operate as a not-for-profit corporation to provide services to 1,750 libraries in Massachusetts, and almost all of our services are at no charge. We serve every public library, 1,200 school K-12 libraries, 120 or 40 academic libraries that join, and 240 special libraries, hospitals, historical societies, and museums. And our most popular services are we provide no-charge access to a whole list of Gale databases, ProQuest Massachusetts Newsstand. We provide delivery service, delivering 14.5 million items a year between 550 libraries. 250 training events that are delivered to our members at no charge, and advisory service by phone, email, and in person on topics that one of our staff members knows enough to give advice on. We employ 17 people in our organization, and 11 of them are professional librarians. So my point of view here is the public libraries are the most active group of our members, and we'd like to change that in the future by inviting some of these folks to participate more, and some of you folks who work in universities to participate more. So my perspective on employment as a music specialist or other specialist will come from the public library perspective or from the consortial perspective. So I wanted to ask, how many of you are students or recent graduates of library school? Okay, a few people just starting out. Congratulations. How many of you are working as music librarians or in a library and use your music specialty now? Most people. Great. And of those folks who are working in libraries as a music specialist, how many work in public libraries? And which library is that? Boston Public Library, great. So, the other thing I want to say about my organization is to put in a shameless plug for a program that we're going to be launching soon. It's called Bibliotemps. We are going to be employing folks to work on a temporary basis in libraries where we will hire them onto our staff and put them to work as a temporary agency in libraries that need help. It's a real advantage to our members to allow that to happen in many cases. And we've teamed up with Simmons GSLIS to help us out with that, to identify potential students and recent graduates who might fill some of those roles. And we're actually providing incentive for employers to hire those people by charging less to promote the career. So watch for that in the upcoming months. So it's also interesting that I was asked to be on this panel because my wife is a career counselor at a university, and occasionally she gets somebody who's interested in libraries, so she sends them to me. And this has let me put my thoughts together on career opportunities and the job market. And I also came into librarianship as a subject specialist myself. I was a Russian major in college, and my career goal was to become a Slavic bibliographer. When I was an undergrad in Russian, the people in the department said, you got to have something to go along with Russian to get a job. And I didn't do anything about it as an undergrad, but I did go to library school and prepared to become a cataloger because that was the doorway in. But as our other panelists have mentioned, being nimble, being geographically flexible, and having other skills to accompany your music specialty are of critical importance in finding employment. I ended up working in an academic library in a cataloging department and finding that I wanted to move out of that type of job, and I was fortunate that a mentor steered me toward the not-for-profit sector that served libraries, and I've really enjoyed that career for many years now. So as a consortium manager, I understand that libraries need access to more skills than they can get, than they can afford on their own. And I've been asking around about public libraries in Massachusetts to see how many had music catalogers, and Boston Public Library is the only one I could identify. I think you have 2 music professionals sort of and 1 vacancy. Is that the case?
No.
No?
One that works with the consortium and maybe 1.5. I'm not aware of any vacancies.
Okay, well, Boston Public Library has a music professional. The other library that I found was the other library in Massachusetts that uses Cutter cataloging, Forbes Library in Northampton. Cutter was there too. I'm sorry? That's what it was? Okay. Well, he proselytized there. They have a combination of music and art librarian there. As I polled the public libraries, they said, what about Brookline? Don't they have one? Many years ago, they had one. Again, a combination music and art librarian. So I think that the public library field is focused on more research libraries that might have a music specialist who does it full time. But I think that a librarian who wants to use a specialty in a public library has the opportunity to blend that skill with another skill and be nimble and geographically flexible. And you may find a very rewarding position. The lifelong learning aspect of the career is really important too, and the willingness to embrace change. I asked public library directors what the number 1 quality they were looking for in a new employee was. Does anybody have a guess? Customer service skills. One half-jokingly said, we look for people that have served as waitstaff and retail. People who can handle people and work well with them. I think public libraries are all juggling really tight budgets, and folks are doing multiple tasks from top to bottom, from entry level to library directors are managing multiple things. Public librarians also felt that someone who had music librarianship specialty could be valuable to a public library in other ways, that they would bring that ability to share with other staff and the public, and also to bring in programming that would be valuable in that library. So, in closing, I wanted to just emphasize the flexibility and the ability to have other skills to go along with music librarianship could bring you into a valuable and rewarding career in a public library. Thank you.